They say the ocean never truly forgets, that every wave carries a memory, every current carries a whisper, and somewhere beneath the dark and endless blue, the past waits quietly, patiently until someone is willing to listen. So tonight, sit back, relax, and let the water speak. Let it pull you into the drifting, moonlit world of the golden age of piracy. A world balanced between brutal survival and strange, impossible freedom. A world where empires stretch their flags across continents. But a handful of desperate men sailors, runaways, rebels, chose to live outside the map entirely. Our journey begins in the late 17th century. At the exact moment the Atlantic world is cracking open, revealing new currents of opportunity and danger. Spain's vast empire, once unshakable, begins to tremble under the weight of endless wars, economic strain, and political exhaustion. The Caribbean, long a guarded treasure chest of silver, sugar, and slaves, becomes a fractured, vulnerable frontier. Merchant ships creak under their cargo, isolated and exposed across thousands of miles of open water. And in those empty stretches far beyond the reach of kings or courts, piracy takes root like fire on dry grass. But this isn't the romantic world of parrots and buried treasure. No, this is the real, storm-torn heart of the Golden Age, where the crack of cannon fire shattered the night, and the line between civilization and chaos blurred to nothing. Some historians argue that piracy rose simply because naval power collapsed. Others believe it was born from deeper frustrations, men escaping unfair wages, brutal captains, or the grinding machinery of empire. Whatever the cause, the sea became a refuge for those who refused to kneel. Imagine it now, lantern light flickering against salt-stained planks, the distant roll of thunder, the taste of brine thick in the air, crews made up of Africans, Europeans, indigenous sailors, and former slavesmen who would never share a meal on land now, stood shoulder to shoulder under the black flag. Their ships were fast, lean, and deadly, built for ambush and vanishing into the horizon. Some researchers call these floating communities accidental democracies, strange little islands of unexpected equality in a rigid colonial world. Others see them as short-lived utopias born from desperation, places where survival was the only law. But whatever they were, they reshaped the Atlantic in ways no one expected. And as we drift deeper into this story, one question lingers on the surface, like a shadow beneath the water. Why did so many risk everything, life, limb, and salt, to live under the black flag? Sit with that thought for a moment. Because, in the next section, the ocean reveals a darker truth as the golden age of piracy began to take hold. Certain ports transformed into hubs of danger and opportunity. Places where lawlessness thrived and fortune could be claimed with a single stroke of audacity. Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, became the crown jewel of these pirate havens, a settlement without kings, yet with its own rules, its own fleeting sense of order. Imagine the streets, narrow, uneven, lined with hastily built shacks, the smell of salt, gunpowder, and sweat mingling in the humid air. Ships of every description crowded the harbor, their sails taut with the wind, each vessel carrying men hardened by storms and desperate ambition. Here pardons were rare, loyalty was measured in gold, and alliances shifted as unpredictably as the tide. Some researchers suggest that Nassau's isolation made it the perfect breeding ground for a society, unbound by the traditional hierarchies of Europe. A place where men from disparate backgrounds, French, Dutch, African, escaped slaves, found themselves united under a single, terrifying banner: survival. From one tavern to another, the air buzzed with rumors of hidden loot, escaped convicts, and brutal retribution for betrayal. The pirate code, or articles, established by figures like Bartholomew, Roberts, and others, outlined not just discipline but a perverse sense of fairness, with rules about dividing plunder, compensating injuries, and even voting on leadership. It was a democracy of danger, built on the fragile foundations of fear, respect, and shared ambition. Yet behind the camaraderie and the bravado, life on the seas was unrelenting and cruel. Disease, storms, and sudden violence were constant companions, and even the most skilled captain could be undone by a single miscalculation. Others argue that the appeal of piracy went beyond necessity or profit. It was the allure of absolute freedom, a seductive promise that one could exist outside the strict confines of empire, beyond the reach of colonial governors and naval patrols. And yet, freedom carried its own price. Every night brought the ever-present threat of naval engagement. Every friendly port might suddenly be a trap. Every encounter with a merchant ship could end in fire, blood, and the sharp smell of smoke and salt. Pirates became both architects and victims of a delicate, dangerous ecosystem, balancing ambition against mortality on a knife edge. And as the tide of history began to turn, with governments marshalling their forces to reclaim the seas, this precarious world faced an inescapable reckoning. But before we reach that point, we must first meet the men who defined it, the legends, the tacticians, and the terrifyingly brilliant captains, whose names would echo across oceans and centuries. Who were they, and how did a few men manage to command fleets with the precision of admirals while living lives that many would consider hopelessly lawless? That is the story that awaits, just beyond the horizon. To understand the golden age of piracy, we must first step aboard the ships themselves, where every plank of wood, every coil of rope, and every creaking mast tells a story of desperation and daring. Picture a vessel cut from dark, weathered timbers, its hulls slick with salt spray, its sails tattered from storms that could rip a man from the deck in an instant. On these ships, life was dictated by the wind and the whims of men who had abandoned or been forced from the conventional paths of society. Pirates navigated the Atlantic and Caribbean with uncanny skill, reading the clouds and waves as though the sea itself whispered secrets to them. Some historians argue that the innovations in ship design and gunnery during this era were not merely for plunder, but a byproduct of necessity. Vessels needed to be fast, maneuverable, and capable of both ambush and escape. Cannons lined the decks, their metal glinting in the tropical sun, capable of turning any encounter into chaos in a matter of moments. The crews were equally disciplined and unpredictable. Some men served loyally, bound by camaraderie and fear of mutiny, while others were recruited from prisons, indentured servitude, or distant ports, each bringing their own skills, grudges, and appetites for risk. Food was sparse and often spoiled, water was rationed, and disease lurked in every dark corner. Yet the promise of immense wealth, silver from Spanish galleons, gold from merchant convoys, drove them forward. It is here, on these rolling decks, that democratic systems emerged in the most unlikely places. Captains could be voted in or deposed. Shares of plunder were distributed according to agreed-upon codes, and disputes were settled with an odd mixture of pragmatism and brutal justice. Some suggest that these codes, paradoxically, imposed more order than the colonial governments that struggled to police distant territories. And yet, every successful raid left a trail of destruction. Villages sacked, ships burned, lives ended. The fear that pirates inspired among merchants and colonists alike was the currency that made their power tangible, from the docks of Port Royal to the hidden coves of the Bahamas. These ships carved pathways through history, leaving both ruin and legend in their wake. As the sun set over the horizon, painting the ocean with streaks of fire and gold, one could almost hear the whispers of men who dreamed of freedom, feared death, and chased a horizon that moved with every tide. But for all the tales of cunning and courage, the question remains, how did such a chaotic and violent enterprise manage to persist for decades, shaping commerce, politics, and culture across the Atlantic world? The answer lies in the next chapter, where we explore the rise of piracy as both a societal phenomenon and an economic force that could not be ignored. The rise of piracy during the late 17th and early 18th centuries was not born from mere greed or lawlessness alone. It was a response to the fractures and failures of empire, the cracks in the rigid structures of trade and colonial authority that stretched across the Atlantic. Imagine the Caribbean as it existed then, an archipelago of glittering islands, each harbor a potential sanctuary, each reef a deadly trap for the unwary, and each port a complex web of commerce and politics. Merchants sailed under the flags of England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, carrying spices, sugar, gold, and slaves, yet the very systems that promised wealth were riddled with vulnerability. Governments often lacked the ships or manpower to patrol the vast sea lanes, leaving routes open to those daring enough to exploit them. Some researchers argue that piracy thrived because it was, in a sense, a mirror to imperial ambition. As empires expanded, their reach exceeded their grasp, creating spaces where law could not keep pace with opportunity. Pirates, for all their violence, became unintended arbiters of the sea, their attacks shaping trade patterns, redirecting fleets, and forcing merchants to innovate in both navigation and defense. And it was not only the Atlantic and Caribbean that felt the shockwaves. News of pirate raids traveled faster than the ships themselves, spreading fear from Havana to London, from Boston to Port Royal. Yet within the chaos, pirate communities fostered a fragile order. Captains were accountable to councils. Shares of plunder were pre-negotiated, and conduct was often regulated by codes that could be surprisingly strict. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of colonial life, these systems allowed for upward mobility and reward based on merit and daring, a fact that did not escape the notice of ordinary sailors, former soldiers, and even escaped convicts. Ports like Nassau, Tortuga, and Port Royal became bustling hubs not merely of lawlessness, but of commerce and culture, where blacksmiths, shipwrights, merchants, and opportunists mingled with men and women who had embraced the pirate life. Some suggest that this blurred boundary between legality and crime allowed piracy to persist. Colonial authorities were reluctant to crush an entire economic ecosystem that had become integral to local prosperity. And yet, every safe harbor, every friendly cove, carried its own dangers. From rival crews to the sudden arrival of a naval squadron sent to restore order, the lure of treasure and freedom was inseparable from the constant threat of death or capture. A tension that gave the golden age of piracy its deadly allure. As we move next to the notorious figures who defined this era, we will see how individuals could rise from obscurity to legend, leaving behind myths that would outlive even the ships they sailed. Among the sprawling fleets of pirate vessels and the hidden coves that dotted the Caribbean, certain names would rise above the rest, their reputations etched into history with a mixture of fear, fascination, and myth. Blackbeard, known to some as Edward Teach, cut an unforgettable figure, a towering man with a long black beard, braided and adorned with ribbons, who would light slow-burning fuses in his hair before battle, creating an infernal visage that terrified enemies before a single cannon fired. Some historians suggest he was more strategist than brute, preferring intimidation to unnecessary bloodshed, a man who understood that fear could be as valuable a weapon as gunpowder. Then there was Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, whose career was brief but remarkably prolific, capturing hundreds of ships over a mere 4 years, his strict code of conduct and flamboyant dress marking him as a charismatic leader who commanded loyalty and respect. Anne Bonny and Mary Read challenged not only the authority of the law but the expectations of gender itself, taking to the seas in defiance of societal norms. Their presence a reminder that the pirate world could, in some ways, be more egalitarian than the rigid hierarchies on shore. These figures were not merely criminals. They were symbols, embodiments of the allure of freedom, the defiance of empire, and the seductive promise of riches beyond imagination. Their lives, however, were a constant balancing act between fortune and fatality, for every successful raid could be followed by sudden capture, betrayal, or violent death. Ships were lost to storms as easily as 2 naval fleets, and alliances could crumble at the first hint of weakness. Researchers have noted that the stories surrounding these captains passed through newspapers, pamphlets, and eventually books, often blurred reality with theatrical embellishment, giving rise to the legends that persist to this day. It was a world where rumor could travel faster than a vessel, where the threat of a single name could empty a harbor or redirect a convoy, and where reputation could be as powerful as any cannon. Yet beyond the spectacle of individual captains, piracy was a networked phenomenon, an ecosystem of crews, informants, merchants, and corrupt officials, each playing a role in sustaining the Golden Age. Every captured ship told a story not just of plunder, but of intelligence, navigation, and strategy, a constant interplay of risk and reward that shaped the flow of commerce across the Atlantic. As the era progressed, these pirates would leave an indelible mark not only on trade and maritime law, but on the cultural imagination, setting the stage for the transformation of real-life criminals into legendary figures, whose exploits would captivate audiences for centuries, from one infamous captain to the next. The human drama of the high seas was about to unfold in ways both thrilling and tragic, and as we move forward, we will explore the intricate codes, hidden havens, and daring raids that defined this extraordinary age of piracy. To truly understand the golden age of piracy, we must look beyond the legends of daring captains and examine the hidden infrastructure that allowed such chaos to flourish. Pirates did not operate in isolation. They relied on networks of secret ports, covert informants, and sympathetic merchants who turned a blind eye to plundered goods in exchange for a share of the profits. Nassau, or New Providence in the Bahamas, became the epicenter of this underground economy, a lawless haven where the usual rules of empire held little sway, and the only authority was that which the pirates themselves enforced. Within these cramped streets and ramshackle taverns, crews exchanged intelligence about heavily laden Spanish galleons, merchant convoys, and naval patrols, planning raids with meticulous care. Some researchers suggest that pirate communities, while anarchic in appearance, operated under surprisingly structured codes, agreements that dictated the division of loot, conduct aboard ship, and even the resolution of disputes through rudimentary forms of democracy. Every crew had its own rules, yet common themes emerged. No captain could take more than his share without consent. Injury and loss were compensated, and decisions could be voted upon collectively, an unusual practice for the rigidly hierarchical societies on land. Beyond their codes, pirates developed sophisticated navigational techniques, exploiting both the treacherous waters of the Caribbean and the seasonal patterns of Atlantic trade winds. They studied currents, charts, and the behavior of merchant convoys, sometimes using captured ships and their crews as sources of intelligence, turning each raid into a blend of strategy, espionage, and opportunism. The economic ripple effects of this system were profound. Insurance rates spiked. Colonial governments were forced to invest in fortifications and naval patrols, and legitimate merchants had to adapt to a new era of calculated risk. Even the architecture of ports shifted, with harbors redesigned to provide security against both pirate attack and the retaliatory strikes of naval powers. And yet, for all the planning and fortitude, the pirates lived on a knife's edge, where one miscalculation could lead to capture or death. Their world was one of constant tension between freedom and peril, of high drama beneath scorching sun and star-strewn skies. As we leave behind the hidden networks and secret havens, we move toward the daring raids and audacious confrontations that would define the legends, revealing the extraordinary interplay of courage, cunning, and sheer chance that shaped the golden age of piracy and the enduring fascination that keeps their stories alive even centuries later. The life of a pirate was a precarious balance between exhilaration and imminent danger, a world in which every horizon held both promise and threat. Imagine the smell of salt and tar, the creak of wooden decks underfoot, the rhythmic slap of waves against a hull that had seen more storms than most men would survive in a lifetime. On these ships, crews were bound not by law but by shared risk and ambition, a camaraderie forged in the fire of survival. Some researchers believe that the allure of piracy was as much about freedom from the rigid structures of empire as it was about gold and plunder. The open sea offered an escape from the constraints of class, from debts, from oppressive masters, and from the watchful eyes of colonial governors. Yet freedom came at a steep price. Each raid required careful observation, timing, and sometimes brutal deception. Pirates would disguise their vessels, fly false flags, or lie in wait for weeks along known trade routes, anticipating the approach of heavily laden merchant ships. The tension on board was palpable, every lookout scanning the horizon, every hand ready at a cannon, every decision a matter of life or death. Even discipline, though informal, was strict. Mutiny, theft from the crew, or cowardice could mean marooning, or worse, a punishment as feared as any naval firing squad. Despite this, the pirates' sense of democracy, voting on captains, sharing spoils, electing or deposing leaders, offered a remarkable contrast to the hierarchies ashore. Historians note that this combination of liberty and peril created a unique culture, one in which loyalty was earned, courage was currency, and reputation could save or doom a man. Beyond the immediate thrill of raids, pirates also had to manage the mundane realities of life at sea, scavenging for fresh water, repairing rigging after storms, rationing food, and tending to injuries with whatever medical knowledge or supplies were at hand. It was a life of extremes, moments of euphoric triumph, juxtaposed with crushing despair, storms that threatened to crush ships, and the constant awareness that a single misstep could bring capture at the hands of naval forces determined to restore order. From one daring raid to the next, pirates carved a presence across the Caribbean and Atlantic, leaving a trail of legends, lost treasures, and whispered tales that would captivate generations. As we leave the decks behind and move toward the ports and havens where these figures hid, traded and plotted, we encounter the paradox of the pirate world: lawlessness that depended upon order, freedom inseparable from risk, and a society that, for all its chaos, left an enduring imprint on the history of the Atlantic world. As pirate ships vanished beyond the horizon, the islands and ports they frequented became stages for another kind of drama, one less violent but no less consequential. Nassau, in the Bahamas, had been a haven where lawless men carved out temporary kingdoms. But with the rise of governmental authority, it transformed into a controlled waypoint, a nexus where the ghosts of piracy lingered amid the bustle of legitimate trade. Ships began to favor routes that had once been avoided for fear of ambush, and the waters of the northern Bahamas, previously a labyrinth of danger, became channels of commerce. Port Royal, Jamaica, once the jewel of the Caribbean, had been shattered by an earthquake and then haunted by continued pirate activity, leaving a vacuum that Kingston eagerly filled. Here, merchants and naval officers worked in tandem, securing the harbor, fortifying positions, and creating a sense of order that the chaotic years of piracy had rendered almost unimaginable. Across the Caribbean, similar transformations unfolded. Ports that had once been isolated or vulnerable became centers of trade, guarded by fleets, watched by patrolling navies, and monitored by the ever-growing networks of intelligence that had once served exclusively to hunt pirates. Insurance companies, responding to the erratic threat of maritime crime, had evolved into sophisticated institutions, analyzing patterns of loss, weather, and security to advise merchants on the risks of each voyage. Lloyd's of London, in particular, had amassed vast records, transforming anecdotal experience into predictive science, providing a foundation for a commercial revolution that would stretch far beyond the Caribbean. These developments reshaped not only the economic landscape, but also the very architecture of colonial power. Fortifications were built, naval protocols refined, and intelligence systems established, creating frameworks that would endure long after the last pirate was hanged or fled. Yet, amid the strictures of law and commerce, echoes of pirate society persisted. The democratic practices aboard pirate ships, once radical in their insistence on shared decision-making and equitable distribution of loot, left subtle imprints on some colonial communities, inspiring debate and occasional reform in local governance. Meanwhile, the legends of notorious pirates Calico Jack and Bonnie began to crystallize. Their exploits exaggerated, their danger romanticized, their lives transformed into stories that fascinated and warned in equal measure. As colonial authorities tightened control, as commerce flourished, and as tales of adventure spread through pamphlets and newspapers, the Caribbean became a stage on which the legacy of piracy could be measured, the costs paid in blood and treasure, the innovations imposed by necessity, and the myths that would endure for centuries. Next, we turn to the technology, tactics, and naval ingenuity that arose from these tumultuous years, a transformation that would echo across oceans and generations, shaping the very nature of maritime power. The seas of the Caribbean, once wild and unpredictable, became laboratories of innovation, where the demands of hunting pirates pushed naval technology and tactics into new territories. Ships were no longer simply vessels for cargo or war. They became instruments of speed, agility, and precision. Fast, maneuverable sloops and frigates were designed to chase down pirates who had once eluded capture with their own clever ships, their shallow drafts allowing pursuit into hidden coves and narrow channels where larger vessels could not follow. Cannons were improved, not only in firepower but in accuracy, and gunnery drills became systematic, transforming crews into coordinated units capable of unleashing devastating broadsides with ruthless efficiency. Intelligence gathering, once an informal endeavor reliant on rumor and observation, matured into organized networks of informants, signal systems, and maritime charts that mapped not just currents and winds but the habits of human predators. Merchants, shipowners, and colonial governors relied increasingly on this information, weaving it into decisions that affected entire economies and trade routes. The line between piracy and naval warfare blurred in subtle ways. Tactics developed to hunt. Outlaws were incorporated into fleet maneuvers. Strategies once considered radical became standard doctrine, and the lessons learned in the pursuit of criminals informed the broader art of maritime conflict. Meanwhile, the very culture of the seas began to shift. Communities once touched by pirate democracy, the brief egalitarianism aboard a ship where captains could be voted out and decisions debated openly left faint echoes in port towns, where some merchants and local leaders experimented with participatory decision-making, inspired by the audacity of men who had lived outside conventional hierarchies. But it was not only practical knowledge that endured. The stories, carefully recounted in newspapers, pamphlets, and later books, immortalized the larger-than-life personalities of pirate captains. Blackbeard's terrifying visage, Calico Jack's flamboyant style, and Bonny's defiance were transformed from the immediate threat of criminals into narratives of adventure and spectacle, their lives dramatized, their violence sanitized, their cunning romanticized. These tales served dual purposes. They entertained, feeding a colonial appetite for danger and rebellion, but they also reinforced moral lessons, illustrating the consequences of lawlessness, while keeping alive the allure of rebellion against authority. As ships sailed faster, cannons roared louder, and intelligence networks spread wider. The Caribbean had become a place where order and legend coexisted uneasily, where the pursuit of criminals spurred technological evolution, and where society began to balance caution with fascination. From one innovation to the next, the maritime world was being reshaped in ways that would echo far beyond the tropical waters, hinting at a future where the memory of piracy would remain as vivid as the innovations it had inspired. Next, we explore the social and cultural ripple effects, the ways pirate myths infiltrated colonial society and reshaped ideas about freedom, law, and human ambition. The end of organized piracy did not erase the social ripples it had caused. Instead, it left subtle yet enduring marks on colonial society, shaping perceptions of authority, freedom, and personal ambition. Pirate communities had operated under rules that, while harsh and often brutal, allowed for unexpected egalitarianism. A crew might vote on decisions, share plunder more evenly than the strict hierarchies of merchant or naval ships, and elevate skill or charisma over birthright. As colonial authorities reasserted control, these fleeting glimpses of alternative social structures left their traces. Merchants and planters who had interacted with pirate crews or observed their operations sometimes incorporated aspects of democratic decision-making into their own enterprises, holding meetings, consulting advisors, or creating more flexible labor arrangements than the rigid systems that had preceded them. Simultaneously, the legend of pirates began to infiltrate popular culture. Their exploits dramatized in newspapers, pamphlets, and books. These accounts often blurred facts and fiction, presenting the daring, clever, or flamboyant personalities of pirate captains while softening the harsh realities of violence and theft. Blackbeard became a symbol of audacious courage, Calico Jack a figure of theatrical rebellion, and Anne Bonny a story of daring defiance. Against gendered expectations, all figures who straddled the line between criminality and folk heroism. The fascination with pirate life also prompted a broader questioning of social norms and hierarchies. Readers, particularly those in colonial towns or on the fringes of imperial control, could imagine a world in which personal skill, wit, and bravery mattered more than inherited rank, if only temporarily, and the tales of pirates provided both a thrill and a mirror to societal dissatisfaction. At the same time, colonial governments leveraged these stories to reinforce authority, emphasizing the inevitable downfall of pirates to underline the consequences of lawlessness and to validate the increasing investment in maritime security. Education, literature, and even public discourse absorbed these narratives, creating a cultural backdrop where pirates symbolized both danger and the tantalizing possibility of freedom. Beyond myth, practical structures born of anti-piracy campaigns, fortifications, patrol networks, admiralty courts, and international treaties permanently altered colonial administration. These developments strengthened the ability of empires to project power across the Atlantic, regulate trade, and coordinate responses to threats, laying foundations for modern maritime governance. The dual legacy of pirates' legend and institutional reform revealed a society negotiating the tension between chaos and order, desire and discipline, freedom and authority. And yet, even as the last pirate ships were captured and hanged, the stories endured, seeding imagination and shaping culture in ways that would outlive the men and women who had once roamed the Caribbean seas. Next, we delve deeper into the legal and economic transformations triggered by the suppression of piracy, exploring how the Golden Age reshaped not only imagination but also the very structures of colonial power. The suppression of piracy during the early 18th century did more than restore order to the Caribbean. It reshaped the economic landscape of the Atlantic world in ways that would resonate for generations. Once the threat of pirate raids diminished, merchants and colonial officials could plan voyages with a newfound confidence, allowing trade routes to expand and diversify. Islands that had once served as pirate havens became centers of legitimate commerce, their harbors transformed from dens of lawlessness into bustling hubs of economic activity. Nassau, Kingston, and other ports that had survived pirate rule leveraged their strategic locations and secure anchorages to attract shipping lines, investors, and skilled labor, creating microcosms of prosperity amid the tropical chaos. This transition was not instantaneous. The remnants of piracy lingered in local memory, and ships still traveled with armed convoys and careful vigilance. But the overall climate shifted. Insurance companies, most notably Lloyd's of London, capitalized on the wealth of information collected during the fight against pirates, transforming risk assessment into a precise, if still speculative, science. By analyzing patterns of losses, weather conditions, and historical pirate activity, underwriters could assign premiums that reflected both danger and opportunity, enabling investors to commit resources to longer, riskier, but potentially more profitable voyages. This emerging infrastructure of maritime finance accelerated the integration of the Caribbean into global trade networks, connecting sugar, tobacco, rum, and precious metals to European markets with unprecedented efficiency. Naval innovation, driven by necessity during anti-piracy campaigns, also left lasting marks on commerce. Faster, more maneuverable ships, advanced gunnery techniques, and improved communication systems not only served military purposes but also increased the reliability and safety of merchant shipping. Beyond economics, the suppression of piracy reinforced governmental authority and institutional sophistication, providing colonial administrations with experience in law enforcement, international diplomacy, and judicial oversight. Admiralty courts, intelligence networks, and cooperative agreements between empires created mechanisms capable of handling transnational challenges, models that would later influence responses to smuggling, privateering, and other illicit activities. Yet, even as colonial governments solidified control, the cultural resonance of pirates remained potent. Tales of cunning, bravery, and defiance against authority circulated alongside economic reports and legal decrees, offering a reminder that human ambition and desire for freedom could flourish even under constraints. The golden age of piracy, though ending in execution and confiscation, had irrevocably transformed commerce, governance, and culture across the Atlantic world. From here, we move to the ways in which the mythology of piracy seeped into literature, art, and the collective imagination, shaping how generations would remember the age of cutlasses and cannon fire. As the 18th century progressed, the stories of pirates began to transcend their immediate historical context, weaving themselves into the fabric of popular imagination and early colonial literature. Newspapers, pamphlets, and broadsides recounted the exploits of notorious captains, often embellishing events to captivate readers who hungered for tales of danger, cunning, and rebellion. The accounts of figures like Blackbeard, Calico Jack, and Anne Bonny blurred the lines between fact and fiction, emphasizing dramatic flair over the stark brutality of piracy. Some researchers suggest that this romanticization served a dual purpose. While entertaining the public, it reinforced the power of colonial authorities by portraying the eventual downfall of pirates as inevitable, a moral lesson underscoring the futility of defying established order. Others argue that these stories allowed a subtle form of cultural critique to seep into the consciousness of colonial society, presenting the pirates brief glimpses of egalitarian decision-making and personal freedom as alternatives to rigid hierarchies. Within these narratives, readers could vicariously experience life outside societal constraints, the thrill of commandeering a ship, the tension of high-seas combats, the intoxicating freedom of choosing one's fate without facing the lethal consequences themselves. Literary techniques of the time emphasized suspense, cliffhangers, and rich sensory detail, turning the reader's imagination into a theater of the mind where the creak of timber, the roar of cannons, and the salt-laden wind could be felt as vividly as if standing aboard the ship. The success of these narratives also fostered a new genre of historical storytelling, blending reportage, adventure, and moral reflection, laying foundations for the later novels, plays, and ballads that would immortalize piracy in Western culture. Visual representations, woodcuts, and paintings added further layers, depicting pirates with tricorn hats, cutlasses raised, and faces lit by lanterns against stormy seas, cementing iconic images that persist to this day. Yet, beneath the glamour, historians caution. there remained a shadow of reality. Piracy had been violent, unpredictable, and economically destructive. And the myths often obscured the suffering and social disruption caused by these criminal enterprises. The duality of fascination and fear, of admiration and moral caution, allowed pirate legends to endure far beyond their historical lifespan. As the decades wore on, the memory of organized piracy faded from the minds of those who had lived through it. But its symbolic resonance only grew, providing a cultural mirror reflecting themes of authority, rebellion, and human ambition. From this cultural transformation, we now move to examine the social and political legacies of pirate communities themselves, exploring how their fleeting experiments in democracy and equality subtly influenced colonial societies long after the last ship surrendered to the crown. The social structures of pirate communities, while often overlooked in mainstream history, provide a fascinating glimpse into alternative forms of governance that thrived on the margins of colonial society. Unlike the rigid hierarchies that dominated European settlements, pirate crews frequently operated under codes that emphasized shared decision-making, equitable distribution of plunder, and collective responsibility for the ship and its crew. Some researchers believe that these codes, such as the famous articles of Bartholomew Roberts or the laws of Captain John Phillips, represented early experiments in proto-democracy, where captains could be elected or deposed, and disputes were settled through councils rather than by decree. Others suggest that these systems were primarily pragmatic, designed to maintain order and efficiency in high-risk, high-stakes environments where mutual trust was essential for survival. The psychological atmosphere aboard pirate vessels was equally unique, a tense mix of camaraderie, rivalry, and constant vigilance, where every creak of the ship or distant sail on the horizon could signal danger or opportunity. Sensory details abound in descriptions of pirate life, the tense of salt spray on the skin, the rhythmic creaking of timbers underfoot, the sting of wind-lashed faces during a storm, the acrid smoke of gunpowder in Batland. These elements reinforced the intensity of communal life at sea. The influence of these social experiments extended beyond the decks of pirate ships, subtly infiltrating colonial ports where former pirates settled or traded, and even inspiring debates among merchants and planters about authority, fairness, and collective action. Some historians argue that the memory of pirate egalitarianism influenced early labor practices, local governance structures, and even nascent political movements in Atlantic colonial societies, though the evidence is often indirect and speculative. Yet, this romanticized egalitarianism existed alongside the harsher realities of pirate existence. Mutiny, violence, and treachery were ever present, and the promise of freedom was often temporary and perilously contingent on the strength of the crew and the skill of its leaders. From the perspective of those living in European-controlled colonies, pirates were both a threat and a curiosity, embodying the extremes of liberty and lawlessness. As colonial authorities gradually extended their reach through patrols, fortifications, and legal reforms, the era of open piracy waned. But the memory of these tightly knit quasi-democratic communities lingered in local consciousness. This tension between freedom and authority, between romanticized rebellion and harsh reality, frames our understanding of the broader legacy of piracy. Next, we turn to the economic consequences of the Golden Age, exploring how the rise and fall of pirate enterprises reshaped trade networks, insurance practices, and maritime strategy across the Atlantic world. The economic impact of piracy during its golden age rippled far beyond the immediate plunder of ships and coastal settlements, shaping the very foundations of Atlantic commerce in ways that are still felt in historical analyses today. Merchant fleets, once confident in their routes, were forced to adapt to the unpredictable presence of pirate vessels, altering shipping lanes, convoy structures, and cargo strategies to minimize losses. Some researchers believe that the constant threat of piracy accelerated the development of marine insurance, as firms like Lloyd's of London meticulously catalogued losses, weather patterns, and risk factors to create sophisticated systems for pricing and mitigating maritime dangers. Others suggest that these financial instruments did more than simply protect merchants. They incentivized safer ship designs, reinforced navigational training, and encouraged collaboration between private and governmental naval forces to secure trade routes. The infrastructure of colonial ports evolved alongside these changes. Harbors were fortified, naval patrols increased, and commercial centers like Nassau, Kingston, and Charleston became hubs not only of legitimate trade, but also of intelligence gathering, where information about pirate movements, seasonal storms, and regional politics was traded as carefully as any cargo. These shifts had long-term consequences, fostering a more interconnected and resilient maritime economy that could withstand both criminal threats and natural challenges. The sensory realities of this economic transformation are often overlooked. The clang of cannon fire as a merchant convoy fended off an unexpected attack, the smell of tar and rope in a bustling port, the sight of hurriedly loaded cargo holds as captains attempted to outpace marauders, all painted a picture of a world where commerce and conflict were inseparable. Simultaneously, piracy created unexpected opportunities for certain actors. Some merchants profited indirectly by supplying pirate crews with weapons, provisions, and intelligence, blurring the lines between legality and criminality. Others capitalized on the fear of attacks by innovating in shipbuilding, cargo storage, and navigation, laying the groundwork for modern maritime logistics. Yet, the suppression of organized piracy in the early 18th century did not erase these legacies. Rather, it institutionalized them, embedding risk management, naval strategy, and global trade coordination into the operational fabric of empires. The economic lessons learned from the golden age of piracy extended into colonial policy and administrative practice, influencing taxation, resource allocation, and diplomatic negotiations across the Atlantic. As we shift focus from trade and commerce, we begin to explore how the suppression of piracy reshaped legal frameworks, creating courts, admiralty procedures, and international precedents that would influence governance for generations, while simultaneously contributing to the mythic narrative of pirates that would captivate imaginations far beyond the Caribbean. With the decline of organized piracy, colonial governments turned their attention to establishing robust legal frameworks, capable of addressing the complex challenges that had once been dominated by outlaw captains and rogue crews. Admiralty courts, originally conceived as specialized institutions for prosecuting piracy, became centers of maritime law where judges, clerks, and officers wrestled with questions of property, contracts, and jurisdiction across vast oceanic territories. Some historians argue that these courts laid the groundwork for modern international maritime law, providing models for cooperation between empires when crimes or disputes transcended national boundaries. Others suggest that the mere existence of these institutions served as a psychological deterrent, reminding both would-be pirates and merchants of the omnipresence of colonial authority. The sensory world of these courts was vivid. the creak of heavy wooden doors opening into solemn chambers, the sharp rustle of parchment as evidence was presented, the low murmur of spectators who had come to witness the fate of notorious captains, the presence of accused pirates, often chained and gaunt from months at sea, created a palpable tension, a reminder of both human fragility and the deadly stakes of maritime lawlessness. Meanwhile, intelligence networks that had been developed to track pirate movements evolved into sophisticated systems of communication and surveillance, allowing authorities to coordinate naval patrols, share reports on suspected criminal activity, and even forecast potential threats to trade before they materialized. These networks were the early precursors to global maritime intelligence, combining observation, human informants, and navigational expertise in ways that shaped colonial governance well beyond the suppression of piracy. The transformation of former pirate havens into regulated settlements was equally striking. Nassau, once a stronghold of libertines rule, became a model of governmental order, complete with fortifications, customs officers, and organized militias. Kingston and other Caribbean ports followed suit, blending commerce, law enforcement, and administrative oversight in a pattern that would define colonial urban centers for decades. Yet, the story of law and order did not erase the cultural resonance of piracy. Pamphlets, newspapers, and the first comprehensive histories by authors like Captain Charles Johnson immortalized the exploits of pirate captains, emphasizing adventure, cunning, and rebellion even as they recorded their ultimate punishment. This duality, legal suppression alongside cultural fascination, created a persistent tension, a space where the imagination of readers could roam free while the state maintained control over the seas. As we turn from the courts and intelligence systems to the cultural afterlife of piracy, we encounter a world where myth, memory, and legend blend seamlessly with historical fact, ensuring that the shadow of the Golden Age would linger far beyond the last cannon fired in its name. The fascination with pirate legends did not fade with the last captured captain. Instead, it grew, feeding into a complex tapestry of myth and memory that would shape popular imagination for centuries. Stories circulated of Blackbeard's terrifying visage, with slow-burning fuses tucked under his hat and smoke curling around, his face as he struck fear into the hearts of colonial sailors. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, women who defied societal norms to take up the cutlass alongside men, became icons of daring and transgression, their very existence challenging rigid notions of gender and power. The printed page brought these figures into parlors, taverns, and coffee houses, where readers could marvel at their exploits, imagining the creak of deck planks under heavy boots, the clash of cutlasses in moonlit fights, and the salty temps of the sea spray that surrounded every daring maneuver. Over time, the stories became increasingly stylized, emphasizing bravery, cunning, and audacity, while downplaying the often brutal and violent reality of life aboard pirate ships. Yet, even in their romanticized form, these tales preserved an essential truth about the Golden Age. The ocean was a space of both danger and possibility, where fortune and ruin could arrive with the next tide. Artists, playwrights, and eventually filmmakers drew upon these legends, amplifying the allure of pirate life with dramatic imagery, exaggerated personalities, and theatrical gestures that cemented certain figures in cultural memory. Meanwhile, the democratic practices of pirate crews, the election of captains, the division of plunder, and the voice of every member in key decisions resonated with audiences living under increasingly rigid hierarchies, offering a tantalizing glimpse of a world where order could be negotiated rather than imposed. In this way, piracy became more than a historical episode. It evolved into a symbol, a mirror reflecting society's fascination with rebellion, courage, and the seductive freedom of the unknown. As we move next into the economic and geopolitical legacies left by the Golden Age, it becomes clear that the story of piracy is not confined to legend alone, but is intertwined with the very foundations of Atlantic trade, colonial administration, and the emerging global order, leaving traces that can still be read in the ports, laws, and cultural imagination of today. As the smoke of cannon fire faded and the last pirate ships were captured or abandoned, the Atlantic world began to settle into a new rhythm, one governed not by the unpredictable codes of outlaws but by the steady hand of colonial powers. The suppression of piracy had immediate economic consequences, reshaping trade routes and commercial priorities across the Caribbean and beyond. Merchants who had once feared the unpredictable attacks of pirate vessels now found a measure of security, allowing them to expand operations and invest in more ambitious voyages. Some researchers believe that the insurance industry, which had developed in response to rampant piracy, matured significantly during this period, refining risk assessment methods and creating models that would influence global commerce for centuries, while others suggest that these developments merely formalized practices that had already existed in rudimentary forms. Ports that had thrived under the shadow of piracy, like Nassau or Port Royal, faced transformation. Some declined, others reinvented themselves as hubs of lawful trade, their harbors bustling with vessels carrying sugar, tobacco, and rum across the Atlantic. Naval innovations born from the fight against pirates far more maneuverable ships, improved gunnery, and advanced tactical maneuvers were incorporated into official fleets, influencing the design and doctrine of naval powers for generations. At the same time, intelligence networks, once dedicated to tracking pirate movements, evolved into systems that supported colonial governance, facilitating communication, coordination, and strategic planning across distant territories. The courts established to prosecute pirates, the Admiralty courts laid the groundwork for sophisticated legal procedures in maritime law, creating precedents that would shape international law and diplomacy long after the last pirate had disappeared from memory. Yet, despite these practical transformations, the cultural and psychological echoes of piracy endured, manifesting in stories, songs, and plays that romanticized the outlaw's courage and audacity. The tension between admiration and fear, between fascination with freedom and acknowledgement of law, created a paradoxical legacy, piracy as both a cautionary tale and an aspirational symbol. Some historians argue that these myths help to embed democratic ideals and egalitarian principles into colonial consciousness, influencing political discourse in subtle, often overlooked ways. Others caution that the romanticization of pirates obscured the harsh realities of their violence and the suffering inflicted on countless victims. As we move next into the social transformations that paralleled these economic and legal changes, we begin to see how communities adapted, how hierarchies reasserted themselves, and how the ghostly imprint of pirate egalitarianism lingered like a whisper on the wind, shaping attitudes, behaviors, and the imagination long after the Golden Age had ended. The end of organized piracy did not merely change trade routes or naval strategy. It quietly reshaped the very fabric of colonial society, creating ripples that extended far beyond the harbors and coves where pirates had once ruled. With the restoration of governmental authority, traditional hierarchies reasserted themselves, and communities that had tolerated or even admired pirate activity now navigated a world where law and order dictated opportunity and consequence. Some scholars suggest that the egalitarian practices observed in pirate communities shared elected captains and the distribution of plunder left subtle but enduring impressions on colonial populations, while others argue these echoes were largely symbolic, romanticized remnants preserved in stories rather than real societal change. Merchants and planters who had witnessed pirate governance sometimes incorporated elements of participatory decision-making into local assemblies, and though these efforts rarely challenged the broader colonial hierarchy, they hint at the tension between the freedom pirates embodied and the restrictions imposed by structured authority. Meanwhile, former pirate havens gradually transformed into legitimate settlements, their lawless pasts giving way to bustling ports, warehouses, and administrative centers. Kingston, for instance, rose from the ashes of Port Royal's decline to become Jamaica's primary commercial hub. Its harbor fortified, its streets regulated, its economy integrated into wider transatlantic trade networks. The culture of piracy, however, refused to vanish entirely. Newspapers, pamphlets, and ballads recounted the exploits of famous captains, blending fact with sensationalized narrative to captivate and warn simultaneously. Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 account, A General History of the Pirates, crystallized many of these legends, highlighting daring feats, theatrical personalities, and the dramatic consequences of defying authority, while softening or omitting the brutal realities of violence and theft. Over time, figures like Blackbeard and Calico Jack evolved from feared criminals into archetypal symbols of adventure, rebellion, and individual audacity, their images reinforced through print culture, storytelling, and eventually visual representations. The duality of piracy, its practical threat to commerce and governance, alongside its romantic allure, created a legacy that influenced literature, political thought, and cultural imagination alike. From one mystery to the next, we observe that while the guns were silenced and the pirate ships dismantled, the ideas they carried of freedom, resistance, and audacious individuality lingering in the collective consciousness of the colonies. And as we move into the next exploration of the long-term economic consequences of the Golden Age, we begin to understand how the suppression of piracy not only secured commerce, but also inadvertently shaped the mechanisms of modern, global trade, setting patterns and structures whose influence would extend far beyond the Caribbean seas. The economic aftermath of the Golden Age of piracy presents a paradoxical landscape, where the destruction left by lawless marauders eventually gave way to unprecedented opportunities for growth, regulation, and innovation. Sit back, relax, and imagine the bustling harbors of the Caribbean slowly returning to order. The echoes of cannon fire fading into the rhythmic lapping of waves against docked merchant ships. Colonial authorities, having invested heavily in fortifications, naval patrols, and administrative infrastructure to suppress piracy, suddenly found themselves overseeing a maritime environment far more secure than before. A network of trade routes and ports humming with the commerce that pirates had once disrupted. Some researchers believe that the development of insurance systems, which had evolved to mitigate the risks posed by pirates, became a cornerstone of global trade. Lloyd's of London and other early insurers had meticulously recorded losses, weather patterns, and threats, creating risk assessments that allowed merchants to plan voyages with unprecedented confidence. Others suggest that the rapid expansion of secure ports and the integration of formerly lawless territories into colonial governance provided a foundation for economic institutions that endured for generations, facilitating everything from customs collection to investment in shipbuilding and cargo transport. The suppression of piracy also prompted technological advancements that would ripple through naval and commercial worlds alike. Faster, more maneuverable vessels designed to hunt pirates influenced the design of ships for trade and war, while innovations in gunnery, navigation, and communication ensured that fleets could traverse long distances with greater safety and efficiency. The suppression of piracy also prompted technological advancements that would ripple through naval and commercial worlds alike. Faster, more maneuverable vessels designed to hunt pirates influenced the design of ships for trade and war, while innovations in gunnery, navigation, and communication ensured that fleets could traverse long distances with greater safety and efficiency. Intelligence networks originally built to track pirate movements became precursors to broader information systems, allowing governments and merchants to coordinate activities across vast colonial empires. Some argue that these changes inadvertently created an early form of globalization, connecting markets in Europe, Africa, and the Americas in ways that piracy had temporarily obscured. Yet there remained an undercurrent of memory, a fascination with the figures who had once threatened these very systems. Blackbeard, Anne Bonny, and others loomed large in public imagination. Their daring exploits romanticized even as historians recorded their crimes. This intertwining of practical consequence and myth-making reinforced lessons about risk, authority, and human ambition, creating a cultural and economic landscape both cautionary and inspiring. And so, as we prepare to move from the concrete economic and technological legacies of piracy to the enduring cultural mythology that shaped literature, film, and popular imagination for centuries, we are left with the tantalizing question: how did a few decades of chaos leave marks so deep that even centuries later, their shadow still informs how we perceive freedom, law, and adventure across the seas? As the golden age of piracy receded into memory, its imprint on culture, storytelling, and collective imagination began to take on a life of its own, transforming ruthless criminals into legendary figures whose exploits captivated audiences for centuries. Picture, if you will, the flickering candlelight of a colonial tavern, the air thick with the scent of salt, rum, and wood smoke, as listeners leaned in to hear tales of daring raids, hidden treasure, and audacious escapes. Some historians argue that these stories, while often sensationalized, served a social function. They entertained, yes, but they also reinforced moral lessons, illustrating the consequences of lawlessness and the eventual triumph of order, even as they allowed listeners to vicariously experience the thrill of rebellion. Others suggest that the fascination with pirates tapped into deeper, almost universal human yearnings: freedom from oppressive hierarchies, the lure of adventure, and the temptation to chart one's own destiny unbound by convention. The narrative conventions established by early chroniclers like Captain Charles Johnson in 1724 cemented this duality, presenting pirates as simultaneously fearsome and fascinating. There lives a paradox of danger and exhilaration. Visualize the vividly described ships, the billowing sails, the glint of cutlasses under the Caribbean sun, and the tense hush before an ambush. Jansen's accounts, though based on fact, amplified drama to capture the imagination of readers who would never set foot on the ocean. Over time, these stories migrated beyond print, influencing plays, songs, and eventually the novels and films of later centuries, embedding the pirate archetype deeply into global culture. Some scholars note that the democratic principles observed within pirate crews, the election of captains, the division of loot, and the collective decision-making, offered subtle critiques of rigid social structures, inspiring admiration even in societies committed to hierarchy and authority. The myth of the pirate became a vessel through which complex ideas about power, liberty, and morality could be explored safely at a distance. Yet, behind the romance lay the reality of brutality, deprivation, and constant danger, a tension that gave the stories their enduring appeal. And so, as we prepare to conclude our journey through the golden age of piracy, we confront the final mystery. How did a period defined by violence, lawlessness, and fleeting fortunes manage to leave behind a cultural legacy that continues to stir imaginations, shape storytelling, and influence the way we dream about freedom, adventure, and life at the edges of society even today? The echoes of this era, both real and imagined, remind us that history is never just what happened, it is also the stories we tell about it. Stories that shape how we understand the past and ourselves, and now. As we reach the final chapter of our voyage through the golden age of piracy, sit back, relax, and let the last echoes of cannon fire, creaking timbers, and the whisper of the wind through the rigging carry you into reflection. The era that once seemed defined solely by plunder, terror, and fleeting fortunes has left a legacy far more intricate and enduring than the simple tales of lawlessness might suggest. Imagine the Caribbean at dawn, mist rising off the water, the scent of salt and damp wood hanging in the air, as merchants and sailors cautiously navigate routes once dominated by pirate fleets. These waters, once fraught with uncertainty and fear, had been transformed by relentless governmental efforts into safer, more regulated passages, a tangible reward for the monumental resources invested in suppressing piracy. Consider the administrative systems, intelligence networks, and naval innovations that arose in response to the pirate threat. Some researchers believe that without these pressures, colonial governance and maritime commerce might have evolved far more slowly, lacking the impetus that piracy provided to innovate and adapt. Others suggest that the cultural imprint of pirates, the legends, myths, and stories passed down through generations, created a kind of social imagination, a mirror in which people could explore ideas of freedom, rebellion, and moral ambiguity. The democratic principles that governed pirate crews, the elective systems, the codes of conduct, all left subtle traces on colonial thought, influencing governance in ways both direct and symbolic. From one mystery to the next, the transformation of former pirate havens into bustling, lawful ports demonstrates a remarkable capacity for societies to reclaim and reshape spaces once dominated by crime, turning chaos into opportunity and threat into structure. And yet, the romanticized image of the pirate persists, a contradiction between reality and myth, brutality and adventure, hierarchy and freedom. Blackbeard, Anne Bonny, Calico Jackal, names that conjure thrilling tales. Yet each lived lives of danger, uncertainty, and ultimate mortality. Their stories remind us that history is rarely clean, often messy, layered with multiple truths, and shaped as much by memory and narrative as by facts. As we drift toward sleep, let the resonance of this era linger, the clang of cutlasses, the roar of cannons, the democracy of pirate councils, the strategic brilliance of naval innovations, and the quiet triumph of order over chaos. The golden age of piracy has ended, yet it whispers across centuries, a haunting, fascinating testament to the human appetite for adventure, freedom, and the eternal dance between lawlessness and civilization. Perhaps, as you close your eyes, you might hear the distant call of a ship's horn, feel the sway of the ocean, and wonder how much of history is shaped not just by events themselves, but by the stories we choose to remember.